The night air was cool as Jake walked toward his horse, his boots crunching softly against the dirt road. The town had settled down, the excitement fading as people returned to their homes. Lanterns still flickered in a few windows, but the streets were quiet now. Jake placed a hand on his horse's saddle, taking a moment to breathe. It had been a long night, but the children were safe, and the men responsible were locked up where they belonged. He should have felt at ease. Instead, a familiar weight settled in his chest, the feeling that his work was never really done. Behind him, the sheriff stepped onto the porch of his office, letting out a sigh as he leaned against the railing. "You did a good thing tonight, Jake," he said. Jake shook his head slightly. "Just did what needed doing." The sheriff gave him a knowing look. "Not everyone would have stepped in like you did." Jake didn't answer. He wasn't the type to seek praise. He just knew he couldn't stand by while a child was in danger. That was enough for him. A soft voice called out, making him turn. "Mr. Jake." Emma stood a few steps away, her little hands clasped together. Her baby brother was sleeping soundly in their mother's arms just beyond the doorway. The woman watched quietly, her eyes filled with gratitude. Jake knelt so he was at Emma's level. "You should be resting, little lady," he said gently. Emma hesitated, then reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out something small. "I don't have much," she said, holding out a tiny silver button. "But I want you to have this, for helping us." Jake looked at the button in her palm. It was old and worn, but it was clear she treasured it. He felt something tighten in his chest. Slowly, he reached out and took it. "I'll keep it safe," he promised. Emma gave him a tired but bright smile. Then, without warning, she hugged him again before running back to her mother's side. Jake watched as the door closed behind them, leaving only the quiet night. He turned the small button over in his hand before tucking it carefully into his pocket. It wasn't gold or silver, but it meant something, and that was more valuable than anything else. The sheriff chuckled. "Looks like you made a friend." Jake smirked slightly as he climbed onto his horse. "Guess so." He tipped his hat one last time toward the house, then turned his horse toward the open land. There would always be more trouble out there, more people who needed help. With a light kick, he rode off into the night, leaving the town behind. The stars above stretched endlessly before him, and the world moved on. But somewhere in that little town, a little girl would always remember the cowboy who kept his promise. Jake Callahan rode slowly down the dusty road, his horse's hooves kicking up little clouds of dirt with every step. The sun hung high in the sky, pouring down heat on the quiet town. It was the kind of heat that made everything move slower, the people, the horses, even the wind. But Jake didn't mind. He had spent most of his life under the open sky, riding from town to town, working on ranches, keeping trouble away when it came too close. Jake wasn't a lawman anymore. Those days were behind him. He had once worn a badge, but after years of chasing outlaws, he had decided he wanted a quieter life. Now he lived on a small ranch a few miles outside town, raising cattle, fixing fences, and minding his own business. It wasn't exciting, but it was peaceful, and peace was something he had learned to value. He had just come from the general store, where he had picked up supplies, some flour, coffee, and a new rope for his horses. As he rode, he tipped his hat at the townsfolk he passed. Some of them knew him well, some only by name, but most had a quiet respect for him. He had helped them once, a long time ago, when bandits had threatened the town. They hadn't forgotten. The road stretched ahead, leading out of town toward the open plains. He could already picture the evening ahead, feeding his horse, making coffee, and maybe sitting on his porch, watching the sun go down. It was the kind of simple life he had grown to love. But just as he was settling into that peaceful thought, something caught his eye. A small figure was running toward him from the far end of the road. At first, he thought it was a stray dog, the way it moved so fast. But as it came closer, he realized it was a little girl. She was barefoot, her dress torn and covered in dust. Her blonde hair was wild, and her tiny arms pumped as she ran, stumbling but never stopping. Even from a distance, Jake could see her face streaked with tears. She was crying, hard, and she was running straight toward him. His stomach tightened. Something was wrong. A child didn't run like that unless they were scared. Without thinking, he pulled his horse to a stop and jumped down, his boots hitting the dry ground with a thud. The girl's sobs grew louder as she neared, her small body shaking with every breath. She reached him, crashing into his legs, grabbing onto his coat with tiny hands. She was gasping for air, barely able to speak. He knelt down, his hands firm but gentle on her shoulders. "What's wrong, little one?" he asked, his voice steady, though his heart was already pounding. The girl lifted her tear-streaked face, her blue eyes full of fear. Her lips trembled as she struggled to form words. Then, in a tiny, broken voice, she whispered 5 words that sent a chill down Jake's spine. "They took my baby brother." Jake felt his whole body go still. The little girl's words echoed in his mind, and for a moment, the world around him seemed to slow down. The heat of the sun, the dust in the air, even the distant sounds of the town, all of it faded. He looked down at the child. Her small hands clung to his coat as if letting go would make everything worse. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her breath uneven from all the running and crying. Tears streamed down her dirty cheeks, leaving little streaks against her sun-kissed skin. Jake gently placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to steady her. "Easy now," he said in a calm voice. "Take a breath. Little one, tell me what happened." The girl swallowed hard, struggling to control her sobs. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing dust and tears together. "Me and my brother, we were just playing by the river," she said, her voice shaking. "Mama sent us to get water. But then, she couldn't finish. Fresh tears welled up in her eyes, and her little body trembled. Jake felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had seen fear before, on the faces of men staring down the barrel of a gun, on townsfolk when outlaws rode in. But this was different. This was the fear of a helpless child. "Who took him?" Jake asked, his voice steady but firm. The girl sniffed, struggling to get the words out. "2 men. Big ones. They came on horses. I saw them. I saw them grab my brother and ride away." Her tiny hands balled into fists. "I screamed. I tried to stop them, but they were too fast." Jake's jaw tightened. He could hear the pain in her voice, the helplessness. She had tried to fight back, but what could a little girl do against grown men? His eyes scanned the road behind her, looking toward the river in the distance. He knew the land well. If they had taken her brother, there were only a few places they could be heading. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle. The girl sniffled. "Emma," she said softly. "All right, Emma," Jake said. "We're gonna find your brother, but I need you to be strong for me, all right?" Emma nodded quickly, her little fingers still gripping his coat. Jake stood up, glancing toward the town. He needed help. If these men had taken the boy, they weren't planning on bringing him back. There were bad folks in these parts, drifters, outlaws, men who made their living off the suffering of others. And if they had taken a child, there was no telling what their plans were. He wasn't a lawman anymore, but that didn't matter. Some things a man couldn't walk away from. Jake reached down, lifted Emma onto his horse, and swung into the saddle behind her. He turned his horse sharply and kicked it into a gallop. They had no time to waste. The chase had begun. Jake's horse thundered down the dusty road, kicking up clouds of dirt as he rode hard toward town. Emma clung to him tightly, her little hands gripping his coat as if afraid to let go. Her sobs had quieted, but he could feel her shaking against his back. She was scared, but she was holding on. That was good. He needed her to be strong. As they neared the heart of the town, people turned to watch. A few men stepped forward, tipping their hats or calling out a greeting, but one look at Jake's face made them pause. They saw the urgency in his eyes. They knew something was wrong. Jake pulled his horse to a stop in front of the sheriff's office. He swung down quickly and helped Emma off, setting her on her feet. "Stay close to me," he told her. Then, without wasting a second, he pushed open the door. Inside, Sheriff Tom Wallace sat behind his desk, sipping coffee. He was a heavy-set man with a thick mustache and a steady gaze. When he saw Jake walk in, he raised an eyebrow. "Well, if it ain't Jake Callahan, what brings you?" "No time," Jake cut him off. He placed a hand on Emma's shoulder and gently nudged her forward. "She needs help. Her baby brother's been taken." The room went quiet. Sheriff Wallace set down his coffee and leaned forward. "Taken?" he repeated, his voice now serious. Emma nodded, her eyes wide. "Two men on horses," she said softly. "They took him by the river." Wallace cursed under his breath and stood up. "You sure about this, Jake?" Jake's eyes hardened. "You think I'd be here if I wasn't?" The sheriff grabbed his hat and belt. "All right, we'll need a search party." Jake was already thinking ahead. He knew the land well. If the men had taken the boy, they'd be heading toward one of two places, either the old canyon pass, where riders could disappear into the hills, or the abandoned shack near the edge of town, where outlaws sometimes hid when they needed a place to lie low. He turned to Emma. "Did you see which way they went?" Emma hesitated, then pointed. "That way," she whispered. Jake followed her finger. The canyon pass. That was bad news. If the men got too far in, tracking them would be near impossible. "We leave now," Jake said. The sheriff nodded and stepped outside. Within minutes, a small group of men had gathered. Townsfolk who had rifles, horses, and a reason to help. Some had families of their own. They knew what was at stake. Jake lifted Emma back onto his horse and climbed up behind her. He looked over the gathered men. "Let's ride," he said. With that, they took off toward the canyon, dust rising behind them. Time was running out, and they all knew it. The horses raced across the open land, their hooves pounding against the dry earth. Jake led the way, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. Time was slipping away. Every second counted. Emma sat in front of him, her small hands gripping the saddle horn tightly. She wasn't crying anymore, but he could feel her body tense. She kept looking ahead, as if hoping to see her baby brother waiting for her. Jake wished it were that simple. Behind them, the sheriff and the rest of the men followed, their rifles strapped to their backs, their faces hard with determination. They all knew what this was. It wasn't just about finding a lost child. It was about stopping the kind of men who would do such a thing. As they neared the river, Jake pulled his horse to a stop and scanned the ground. He had spent years tracking outlaws, and he knew how to read the land. He slid off his horse, crouched down, and studied the dirt. Deep hoof prints cut into the ground, heading straight toward the canyon pass. The tracks were fresh. "They went this way," Jake said, pointing ahead. The sheriff nodded. "If we ride hard, we might catch 'em before they get too deep in." Jake climbed back into the saddle, but before he could kick his horse forward, Emma's small voice stopped him. "Please," she whispered. "Please find my brother." Jake looked down at her. His jaw tightened. "We will," he promised. With that, they rode forward, pushing their horses faster. The canyon pass was dangerous. Twisting trails, sharp rocks, and plenty of places for a man to hide. If the outlaws were smart, they would find a spot where they could wait in the shadows, ready for anyone who came after them. The wind picked up as they entered the pass, whistling through the narrow rock walls. Jake kept his eyes sharp, scanning for any sign of movement. He could feel the tension in the air. The men behind him were quiet, their hands ready on their rifles. Everyone knew this could end badly. Then, just as they rounded a bend, Jake saw it, smoke rising from a hidden clearing up ahead. A campfire. His heart pounded. "They're here," he murmured. He slowed his horse and signaled for the others to do the same. They moved carefully now, every step measured. If they rushed in, the outlaws might panic and do something foolish. Jake slid off his horse, pulled out his rifle, and took a deep breath. The baby was somewhere in that camp, and one way or another, he was bringing him home. Jake crouched low behind a boulder, his rifle steady in his hands. The soft glow of the campfire flickered ahead, casting shadows on the rough canyon walls. He could see two men sitting by the fire, their backs turned. One of them laughed, the sound sharp in the quiet night. A small bundle lay on the ground nearby, wrapped in a blanket. Jake's breath caught in his chest. The baby. Behind him, the sheriff and the other men moved carefully into position. They knew better than to charge in without a plan. One wrong move could put the child in danger. Jake studied the two men by the fire. Their clothes were dusty, their hats pulled low, and their guns rested within arm's reach. They looked like drifters, men without a home, without a conscience. Emma clung to Jake's coat, her small hands gripping the fabric tightly. He could feel her shaking, but she didn't make a sound. She was watching the bundle on the ground, her eyes wide with fear and hope. Jake leaned down and whispered, "Stay here. No matter what happens, don't move." Emma nodded, her lips pressed together to keep from crying. Jake turned back to the fire. He had faced plenty of outlaws before, but this was different. A child's life was at stake. There was no room for mistakes. He raised his rifle and aimed. "Drop your guns," he called out, his voice calm but firm. The two men froze. One of them slowly turned his head, his hand creeping toward his pistol. "Don't," Jake warned. "I won't ask twice." The sheriff and the others stepped forward, their rifles aimed. The men by the fire exchanged glances, realizing they were outnumbered. Slowly, one of them raised his hands. The other hesitated, but then did the same. Jake kept his gun steady as he walked toward the fire. His boots crunched softly on the dirt. He reached the blanket on the ground and carefully lifted it. A tiny face peeked out, eyes closed, cheeks flushed from the warmth of the fire. The baby let out a soft whimper. Relief flooded through Jake. The child was safe. He turned to the outlaws, his expression hard. "Why'd you take him?" he demanded. One of the men, a wiry fellow with a scar across his cheek, shrugged. "Thought we could get some money for him," he muttered. "Didn't mean no harm." Jake's jaw tightened. No harm. Taking a baby, leaving a little girl alone and terrified. He wanted to say more, but now wasn't the time. The sheriff stepped in, his voice cold. "You'll answer for this back in town." Within minutes, the men were tied up, their weapons taken. Jake carried the baby back to Emma, who gasped when she saw him. "My brother," she cried, reaching for him. Jake knelt down and placed the child in her arms. She held him close, tears spilling down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of joy. Emma clutched her baby brother tightly, her small arms wrapped protectively around him. Tears streamed down her face, but she wasn't crying from fear anymore. These were tears of relief. Her little brother was safe. He was warm against her, his tiny fingers curling slightly as he made soft noises. Jake watched them for a moment, feeling a weight lift from his chest. He had seen too much loss in his life, too much pain, but tonight was different. Tonight, a family had been put back together. Behind him, the sheriff and the other men kept their rifles trained on the two captured outlaws. The fire crackled in the silence, the flickering light casting long shadows on the canyon walls. Sheriff Wallace stepped forward and looked down at the two men, his face like stone. "You boys made a big mistake," he said. "Stealing cattle is bad enough, but taking a child. There ain't a place in this land where folks will stand for that." One of the men, the wiry one with the scar, shifted uncomfortably. "We weren't gonna hurt the kid," he muttered. "Just thought we could get some money." Jake's jaw clenched. "You don't take children," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Ever." The outlaw dropped his gaze, knowing there was no excuse that could save him now. The sheriff sighed. We'll take them back to town and let the judge decide their fate." He turned to the men standing nearby. "Tie 'em to their horses. We leave now." Jake helped Emma onto his horse again, making sure she was holding onto her brother tightly. Then he climbed up behind her, steadying her as they turned back toward town. The other men did the same, dragging the outlaws along with them. The ride back was quieter, the air filled with a sense of finality. The danger had passed, but the weight of the night still hung over them. The stars shone brightly above, the moon casting a soft glow on the land. Emma leaned back against Jake, her body finally relaxing. She was exhausted, but she refused to sleep, as if afraid she might wake up and find it had all been a dream. "Thank you, Mr. Jake," she whispered after a while. Jake looked down at her, tipping his hat slightly. "You're a brave little girl, Emma," he said. "You did good." She smiled a little, though her eyes were heavy with sleep. As they rode into town, the lights from the houses and lanterns welcomed them back. People were already waiting, drawn by the sound of horses and whispers of what had happened. When they saw Emma safe and her baby brother in her arms, relief murmurs filled the air. Jake exhaled, knowing this night had ended the right way. But in his heart, he also knew that some things in life, like the kind of men who had done this, would never change. As Jake and the others rode into town, people gathered in the streets, their faces filled with curiosity and concern. Lanterns flickered in the night, casting a warm glow over the dusty road. The moment the townsfolk saw Emma clutching her baby brother tightly, relieved whispers spread through the crowd. A woman gasped and pushed forward. "Emma," she cried, rushing toward them. Emma's face lit up. "Mama," she called out, her voice breaking. Jake pulled his horse to a stop and helped Emma down. She ran straight into her mother's arms, still holding her little brother close. The woman wept, kissing both her children, whispering words of comfort and love. The sight made something tighten in Jake's chest. He had seen too many families torn apart, too much grief. But tonight, for once, things had ended the way they should. Sheriff Wallace and his men pulled the outlaws down from their horses. The sheriff's expression was grim as he looked at the men. "Take them to the jail," he ordered. "They'll see the judge come morning." The townsfolk murmured among themselves, shaking their heads at the captured men. Everyone in town knew that taking a child was one of the worst things a person could do. These men wouldn't find any sympathy here. As the outlaws were led away, Emma's mother turned to Jake. Her eyes were filled with gratitude, but words seemed to fail her. I don't know how to thank you," she finally whispered. Jake gave a small nod. "No thanks needed, ma'am. Just glad they're safe." Emma wiped her face and looked up at Jake with tired but grateful eyes. "You kept your promise," she said softly. Jake crouched down so he was at her level. "That's what a cowboy does," he said with a small smile. "Takes care of folks who need help." Emma smiled, her eyes shining despite the exhaustion. Then, to Jake's surprise, she threw her little arms around him in a tight hug. He hesitated for just a moment before gently patting her back. The townsfolk began to drift away, satisfied that justice would be served and that the children were safe. Emma's mother led her toward their small home, holding them close as if she would never let go again. Jake watched them for a moment before turning to the sheriff. "You think those men will talk?" he asked quietly. The sheriff sighed. "Maybe. But even if they don't, they won't be a problem anymore." Jake gave a small nod. He knew there were always more men like them out there, always more trouble waiting. But tonight, at least, a little girl and her baby brother were safe. As he stepped back toward his horse, he glanced once more at Emma. She stood in the doorway of her home, watching him. When their eyes met, she gave him a tired but grateful wave. Jake tipped his hat, then turned and walked into the night. His job here was done.